Hello and welcome. My name is Hanna. I am a priest here at the Church of St. Clement, located on the corner of Montana and Campbell. And this is our first recording. Some have called it the KenKast. We're calling it a webinar. But this is our first episode of a survey of the Bible. It is a visual survey, comes with this large chart, which I will probably not use in these recordings, but I can make those available if, we can talk about those as time go on. But this survey is one that I actually grew up. My dad used to teach in seminary in Mexico, down in Puebla, and then I taught it also for several years, and this is the first time ever recording and teaching to a camera and to an audience that is not personally live at the time. So there are a few things we're going to try to figure out here. And one of those is question, answer, and interactive. So maybe we can do those via email and we can answer things, in subsequent episodes. There's a few ideas out there, but let's start with the visual survey of the Bible. And today we'll be covering the reasons for a survey of the Bible. And one of those, probably the most important one to me, is that often, or shall I say, many people think of the Bible as God's holy book with God's message, which would be an accurate understanding or statement. The difficulty with that is that there's all these assorted books and the breakdown of Scripture, and there's all these stories and these narratives and these characters, and we're left going, yeah, but what is the central message? What is the theme? How does Leviticus relate to Philippians, or how does Revelation relate to Malachi? And so we've got all these challenges. And so one of the reasons for a survey is just to help us understand that overview and kind of put all those pieces together in one basic vein. And so this study looks at the basic redemptive promises that God makes throughout Scripture. And so we'll be zeroing in, we'll be focusing in on those things and following his promise throughout Scripture. The Bible is the historical account of how God created man, how man rebelled against God, and then how God, in his great love, makes a way for man to be restored to fellowship with him. And that's through his son, Jesus Christ. And so that is really the theme that runs throughout the Scriptures. Question on the side, however, is if I were to ask you, the viewer, what is, in one sentence, what is the basic message of the Bible? Hopefully you're thinking of various ways to explain that. If you just walked up, someone walked up to you on the street and said, what is it? Tell me a bit about the Bible. Would you start with, well, there's 66 books and they break down in historic, and there's poetry, and there's books of law, and there's books of prophecy. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily want to get into that complex description right away with somebody asking, but often that is what causes people to lose their desire to read and understand Scripture, is because they don't know where to start and where to go with it. So again, I would say, in summary, the message of the Bible is, you could say, God made it, man broke it, God fixed it. That's one simple way to say it, right? Well, it is also the story of God interacting with his creation to bring about restoration and to show his love. It's the story of God's love and man's salvation. And that's what we're looking at as we go through. So let's back up now. The Old Testament, well, the Bible, there's 66 books, and it breaks down into two testaments, the Old Testament, the New Testament. We will primarily, on this study, be looking at the Old Testament, which is 39 books. There are five books of the law. There's 12 books of history, 5 books of poetry, and 17 books of prophecy. And all of these books were written by roughly over 40 authors over the span of 1,500 years. Well, that's the entire Bible, but you get the picture. It's a big, complicated book. So as we study it, we want to also understand that although it is a big, complicated book or a library of books, God intended it to be very simple because his message for us is that he loves us and there is a way to be restored to him. And that, again, is through Jesus Christ. Now, if we're going to really study the scriptures and understand the message that God has for us, it's essential that we understand the first 3 chapters of the Bible. That's found in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. You could almost say 3.5, but really let's just go with 3. So the first 3 chapters lay out the basic foundation for the rest of Scripture, the whole rest of the story. So we start with God opening up in creation. He creates the heavens, the earth. You know, if we read in Genesis 1:1, right, the God, or the world was chaos, there was a void, and God was moving over the waters, and the Spirit of God was involved. And then God speaks, and he begins to create what we now see as this order of life, this world around us. So God creates, he begins to form, and then he fills things in subsequent days, the various 6 days of creation and the 7th day of rest. He makes light, and then later he fills it in with the stars, the moon, the sun. He creates earth, and then he fills it in with creatures. He creates water. He draws the water, and he separates the land, and then he fills the water. And he creates the atmosphere, and then he fills the atmosphere. So very much of what God is doing is he begins, then he fills, and then he gives things purpose as they work together. God's crowning, shall we say, crowning achievement, or his crowning aspect of creation, culminates in mankind. Mankind, Adam and Eve, Adam, which is Hebrew for man. So mankind is the greatest thing that God created. Let's think about that for a moment. You are God's greatest achievement in creation. All our faults, all our brokenness, that's how special we are to God. That's how special we are to him. Is that mankind he creates us in such a way that he gives us his image. He gives us abilities, and he places man over all of creation. It's incredible. It's humbling when we begin to think about really mankind's value to God. It's dumbfounding, honestly. So he creates man in his image. He places Adam in this garden, and eventually Adam, he's tending to the garden. He was created to work and care for things that God left him in charge of. And we see as we continue into the story, he is alone. And so God then gives him the woman, Eve, to work with him and to help him throughout the tasks that God has left him with. He gives Adam a very distinct rule, which is you can eat from everything in this garden except this one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is the one thing you cannot do. And we'll look more in depth in this as we get into the study. But this is sort of the beginning. Again, in chapter 2 of Genesis, there's this tree, and he's given instruction not to eat from it, because if you eat from it, you will surely die. Now that can go into a whole other topic, maybe a whole other recorded session, but it's a big statement right there. So eventually, as we progress through the first 3 chapters, we find that as Adam and Eve are tending to the garden, Eve is deceived by this serpent. And again, we'll get more in depth on that, but she's deceived by the serpent, and we encounter what we call in just the fall of man, where Eve is deceived, and then she goes to Adam, gives him of the fruit, and he likewise is deceived because he again, I don't want to get too far into that and get off on a rabbit trail, but so there's the fall. There's the fall. And then God responds, and he comes, and this is the first redemptive promise. We find it in Genesis 3:15, Genesis 3:15, where God tells man the consequence of their choice to eat from the tree. And he gives the consequence to the serpent that we later come to understand as the enemy, the adversary, the Satan. And he gives him a consequence, he gives the woman a consequence, and he gives the man a consequence. And then he sends them out. But he gives this promise that although they are separated and although they're sent out of the garden, coming down the line, the seed of the woman will redeem, and he will crush the head of the serpent. And there will be this thing that happens, that takes place. But yet he also says the serpent will bruise the heel of the seed of the woman. And so, again, as we look at Genesis, you kind of left going, okay, what's that all about? Is that why I don't like snakes? Well, maybe. No, not really. There's more to it. Clearly, there's more to it. So, this is then where we begin with the rest of Scripture. Adam and Eve are given this promise that there will be a descendant that will fix the problem. And so Adam and Eve then are out of the garden. They're living east of Eden, shall we say. Shout out to one of my favorite authors. And they have these other children, and they have Cain and they have Abel. Then Cain and Abel have their own issues as well. And this is, again, we're just talking overview of the Old Testament. So Cain and Abel, they bring a sacrifice to God, and this is where we begin, we see the first sort of formal institution of a sacrificial offering to God. Abel brings his, Cain brings his, God accepts Abel's, not Cain's. There's a reason for that, but Cain is upset and angry. He grows resentment towards his brother and eventually ends with our first recorded murder in history. Cain kills Abel. I'm sure there is a grieving process we don't know much about because Scripture often will just focuses in on the important details to tell us about God's plan of salvation for us. So then Adam and Eve, they have a third son named Seth. And Seth begins to be the one that receives the promise that was given about a descendant. So Seth continues on, and as we progress further into Genesis, we find ourselves Genesis 6. There's the multiplication of man, and they start having kids, and they're filling the earth, but then there's corruption. And we find that there are a few good men. For instance, Enoch, one that we know, he was an Old Testament early prophet. And he would speak, and he walked with God, and it was known that he was a man of God. And then what we know about him in Scripture is that then he was no more because God took him. And we also find that the line of mankind, as it develops, it becomes more and more corrupt. So we have Nimrod, who gathers people together, and he forms this society. And this is where we also find the first instituted false religion. Nimrod gathers the people and they start to build a tower, the famous Tower of Babel. And so God confuses the language so that man will not be further deceived. And unfortunately, the corruption continues. So then moving further into our overview, we find Noah. This, again, a direct descendant of Adam and Eve through the line of Seth. Noah arrives on the scene, and he is given the task of building an ark. A large boat that was roughly 450 feet long, roughly 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Massive structure for the day. Took him and his sons over 100 years to build, and when God decided it was time, he had Noah and his sons and their family and various animals all get onto the boat. He closes the door, and then the rains come, and we enter into the next phase of our overview, which is the flood, the great flood that wiped out mankind. Oh, but did it? You see, once again, God, when he makes a promise, he is faithful to himself, and he keeps his promises. So if you recall, he made a promise that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent, and the serpent would bruise his heel. But what's going to happen if he wipes out all of humanity? Well, he breaks his promise. God's not going to do that. One of the beautiful things about him is he will never break his promise. It is not in his character to break his promise. So he maintains humanity through Noah and through his sons and their descendants. And so once again, Noah and his descendants become the inheritors of this great promise of redemption. And so they continue on. And then we have Shem, Ham, and Japheth, his three sons. And there's a whole other story there that we don't want to get too caught up in. But they end up developing into their own tribes, and they go off into their own regions and their own people groups. And mankind begins to do what they were told to do in the beginning, which was to multiply and fill the earth. So they go and they start to fill the earth. We arrive roughly at 2000 BC with Abraham. Abraham is one of Shem's descendants. So you have Adam, Seth, Noah, Shem, and then Abraham. This direct line going all the way back to the garden. Abraham, he's just living in a pagan land. And God speaks to him and calls him. And he says, follow me. And actually, he doesn't even say, follow me. He says, go and I'll lead you. Doesn't even tell him where he's going. Just says, go. That's crazy talk, if you ask me. I wouldn't personally, if I was just told, hey, just go somewhere, and along the way, I'll show you where you're going. Yeah, that'd be rough. So, Abraham goes. And he becomes also the inheritor of this great promise that God had given mankind. And this promise begins to develop. And we will come back in further studies. We'll come back to Abraham. So we will touch on the promise to Adam and the promise to Abraham. We'll skip some of those things in between. But let's continue on with the overview. So Abraham continues. He goes on this journey to find where God is leading him. And he has his son Isaac. And Isaac is eventually, and Abraham, we'll get more into his story when we talk about the promise to Abraham, so I don't want to shortchange anyone right now, but anyway, let's continue on. And so Isaac is his son. Isaac marries Rebekah. They go on, and Isaac sort of becomes the tribal leader after Abraham. But then even Abraham, he passes. Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau. And I'm sure at this point you've heard of Jacob and Esau, some of the two most colorful characters of Scripture, although I tend to think all of the characters of Scripture are very colorful. If you really look too much in depth in their life, they're extremely colorful. Well, so Jacob and Esau, Jacob steals Esau's blessing, and they're estranged. Jacob runs for his life, and there's this whole other story of redemption and them coming back and forgiveness and making things right. But that promise that was originally given to Adam continues on through this line. So then Jacob becomes the inheritor and the line that continues on with the promise. His son is named Joseph. Joseph, one of the younger sons, And he had 10 older brothers that did not appreciate favoritism, and they did not appreciate that he would say things to them that I guess they found insulting. If I was an older brother and I was told that I was going to bow down to my younger brother, I'd be insulted as well. I don't know if I would try to kill my brother, but I would be insulted. But so they tried to kill him. They decided not to. They sell him off into slavery. And this is where we begin to see that God, even in these actions, he's setting the stage to care for his people and to protect them. So God had already even indicated to Abraham that there would be this 400-year period of slavery. And so he sends Joseph, goes off as a slave to Egypt, and there we begin to see the story of how the Israelites, or the descendants of Abraham and Isaac, we see them migrate to Egypt, and then eventually over time they become slaves. And this is where God has already set the stage to care for them, to guide them, however difficult it is. They end up in 400 years of bondage and slavery, and it's dark, and it's depressing, and it's horrible what's happening. But eventually we come then to Moses. So now we've arrived at the book of Exodus, 1450 BC. Moses had grown up in Egypt, being raised as one of the princes of Egypt. He was the adopted son of one of Pharaoh's daughters. And Moses, that's a whole other story in itself. He is called by God to free his people, the Israelites, here having been raised as an Egyptian. But he's called to free his people. And so he obeys God, and he goes, and this is where we then find the 10 plagues of Egypt, and just fascinating history about God delivering his people, and they're led out into the desert where they encounter this miraculous separation of water, and they cross through dry land, and they're freed. And so then we arrive at the Mosaic Covenant, where God gives specific instruction and guidance to his people on how to honor him and walk with him as their God and as his people. And unfortunately, that covenant is not always honored and upheld, and we see that as a result of the Israelites wandering. Many die in the desert as they wander. Even Moses himself is not allowed into the promised land because of their lack of adherence to the Mosaic Covenant. After Moses comes Joshua, roughly 1400 BC. Joshua takes over the mantle of leadership for the people, and he leads the people into the promised land. Some fascinating, wonderful stories that we can reflect on and read about. But again, this is simply just an overview of all the major events. So Joshua leads his people in, and they hold a little better to the Mosaic Covenant and to the guidance. But eventually, Joshua dies, and the people are left with no distinct leader. And so the time of the judges begins. The time of the judges, you'll find that in the book of Judges, is when there are all these distinct smaller leaders of different regions, and they're all guiding and leading and speaking into the people. At times there is conflict. They're physically freeing people. Some of those we know as Samson, one of the most famous of the judges. We probably all know about Samson. And so that's the time of the judges. But unfortunately, even with these distinct regional leaders, the people are not happy, and they begin to demand a king. They want to have a leader just like the other nations. They want to be a nation like the other nations. And so God gives his people what they desire, although he tells them this will be problematic for you. This will be another point in further videos that we'll touch on, is the promise to Saul and to David and the various kings. And so he says, you will not necessarily want this, but I will give it to you. And so he gives them a king. And the Israelites then become a united kingdom. There's the north, the south. We have King Saul. He's the first king, roughly 1050 BC. And he rules for about 40 years. And Saul begins to make his own decisions. And he becomes disobedient. We'll just leave it at that. He disobeys God in many different ways. And so then God raises up David, the king, the man after God's own heart. And so David then comes to the scene and he begins to rule after Saul. And again, that whole story, it's the story of a shepherd turned king. But as we even look at the story of David, we see that his lineage goes all the way back to Abraham. It's a very distinct line. He is a direct descendant of Abraham, who was a direct descendant of Shem, who was a descendant of Seth, who was a descendant of Adam. Eventually, we'll pick up all those pieces, but all those key characters are very important because this is the promise that God made about redemption, and then it fleshes out through all these characters, and eventually it arrives at us. So after David comes King Solomon. And Solomon ruled Israel. There was godliness, but eventually even Solomon loses his way, leads the people down a physically, morally, spiritually bankrupt system. And he leaves his people very divided. And actually, in Old Testament survey, that's exactly where we arrive, which is then the divided kingdom. Solomon's sons, some rebel, some stay faithful, and there's this division. We have the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, and it's honestly quite a disaster. There's Jeroboam, Rehoboam, two of his sons. Jeroboam is the northern 10 tribes. Rehoboam is the southern side, and things don't go well for them. Solomon's, I'm losing my train of thought, but things don't go well. And so there's this division, there's tribes, there's the northern, southern kingdom, and God's people are struggling at this point. And so God brings about all his various prophets. This is where we arrive at the 17 books of prophecy that we find in the Old Testament. And these various prophets speak, some of them, again, to very distinct geographic regions. Others speak to the people in general. Some of those we find like Isaiah, Jeremiah. But then we also have those minor prophets that are a little more regional. Like, for instance, Jonah, a very famous one. We have Joel, which is another very not as widely known prophet. And eventually, the prophets speak. There's various aspects of captivity. Israel is now under the rule of King Cyrus. And Cyrus, the king of Persia, he allows the Israelites to return to their land. There's this, again, they're in captivity at this point. We're roughly at 540 BC. Cyrus conquers Babylon, frees the Israelites, and they travel back, they migrate back, but yet the prophets are still speaking. And then we're arriving now at the final stages of the Old Testament, and we arrive at the Book of Malachi. And this promise that began with Adam and Eve, the promise to Adam, which is that there would be a seed that would crush the head of the serpent, continues on through all these characters and through these complex divisions of politics and leadership and kingdoms, northern, southern, prophets. This promise remains. and it grows and it fleshes out with the people. But it arrives at Malachi. And Malachi foretells that there will be a coming messenger. And this messenger will be like Elijah. And that this messenger, like Elijah, would be sent from God to prepare them for the coming promise of a Messiah. In Malachi, then, we arrive at what we call in survey language of the Bible, the 400 years of silence. Malachi is the last word from God that is distinctly recognized as part of the canon of Scripture. He is the last word, and then there's this 400-year period where God does not clearly, distinctly speak to his people. They have those scriptures, and they have their faith to depend that what Malachi promises by way of a coming Messiah, the promise of this Messiah, and they wait. And that's really a brief overview of the Old Testament, trying not to get too far into rabbit trails. I hope it's not too confusing and too sporadic, but we're going to stop there today because next session we will briefly talk about an overview of the New Testament, which has its own books, its own breakdown of scriptures, but the primary focus of the New Testament overview is to focus in on Jesus, because if you are watching this today, you already know that the promised Messiah is Jesus Christ. Spoiler alert, right? Well, he came, and that is why we have the New Testament, we have the New Testament, and that is why here we are a couple thousand years later, meeting in churches and worshiping Christ. But again, it's good to know sort of the big picture of it all. So thank you for joining me, and God bless you. May this be a journey for all of us, growing in our depth of Scripture and our knowledge and faith in God. And most of all, may our love for God grow and reflect the great, deep love that he has for us.